we will hear from Penny Remfry, trustee and founding member of Rape Crisis Tyneside and Northumberland. Penny Remfry has been actively involved in women's liberation since the 1970s. Join her for this discussion of the movement and its demands and discover some of her incredible personal archive of campaign posters taken in the struggles for anti-colonial, anti-imperial and workers as well as women's rights. She'll be asking, how far have we come in 50 years of protest? Penny was actively involved in the women's liberation movement in the 1970s and 80s. Among other activities, she contributed to setting up a local refuge and the Tyneside Rape Crisis Centre, both of which still provide support to women. She has continued to be involved in women's campaigning activities since then and is still involved with Rape Crisis as a trustee member and a member of a local women's group. So I think all I need to do now is welcome Penny to the stage. So can everyone put their hands together and welcome Penny Remfry, everybody.
Hello, everybody. Well, so I have the wonderful task of talking about how far have we come since the 1970s in women's rights. And I thought what I've done is to bring some of my posters, because for all sorts of reasons, which I don't really remember now, I collected posters. And like many, many people in my generation, we had posters all over our houses. Wherever we lived, we'd get a poster and stick it up on the wall. But where I was concerned, rather than just taking them down when they got tatty, I kept them. And I kept them for years and years and years and years. And then I just rediscovered them. Not so very long ago, really, all rolled up under my bed. And so I started unraveling them. And I discovered that I've got some really nice posters. So we're going to see some of those posters this evening. But just to give you a bit of background to me, when I was a young woman, I travelled quite a lot. I signed up for a couple of volunteer programs. So I spent 18 months in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago. And then, after that, I went to Southern Africa, to Botswana. Both those countries were newly independent at the time. So I was very aware of the whole idea of freedom from colonialism, and the whole notion of liberation was very powerful. But after that, I then went to, I had a degree in sociology, which is why I was working in community development in these two countries. Sort of working, not really. But anyway, community development was my thing. And so I signed up for a postgraduate degree at Mcgill in Montreal. And that's where I really began to kind of put my thoughts into some kind of political order and started collecting posters. So, for me, for a previous generation, I think the images coming from the Russian Revolution were really powerful. I'm talking, if you think about those powerful images of workers in particular, not necessarily particularly of women, but in the Cultural Revolution of China, women had a very important role. And actually, living in North America at the time, the Cultural Revolution was in the 1960s, but it was going on. And in North America, China was of great interest. And actually at Mcgill, there was a fellow called William Hinton who wrote a book called Fan Shen, which is still, I think, an absolute classic. It's about he'd spent some time in China in a small town, small village, when the revolutionary forces came through. And the book is about how the women there in the village overthrew the landlords, the male landlords, and also pointed out the violent husbands and banished them as well. Very inspiring story. And part of that whole kind of idea was that, as that poster says, women's liberation, women in the process of liberating their country, whether it's from colonialism or imperialism or whatever, could also liberate themselves. Next slide, please. So here's one from Vietnam, well, about Vietnam, because of course, the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, Vietnam War was really big. That was probably the first poster I got, and if you look at it closely, you'll see it's very tatty. It spent a lot of time on walls with blue tack. The thing about the revolutionary struggles was that certainly a lot of the posters and a lot of the storytelling about it, there's a lot of poetry involved as well. So here's a poem that went with that poster, Ho Chi Minh. The wheel of law turns without pause. After the rain, good weather. In the blink of an eye, the universe throws off its muddy clothes. For 10,000 miles, the landscape spreads out like a beautiful brocade, light breezes, smiling flowers. High in the trees, amongst the sparkling leaves, all the birds sing at once. Men and animals rise up reborn. What could be more natural? After sorrow comes joy. You know, the idea that, yes, there's a struggle to be had, but after that, you know, we have a new world we can all live in and be happy. Next, okay. So we're talking about the 1970s now, and there were anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggles going on all around the world. Vietnam wasn't the only one. And there was a real optimism to these, well, certainly from our perspective in the West, the liberation struggles. I should have said, in terms of the Vietnam War, that poster, I'd spent a summer in California, and it would have been 1969. And at that time, there was so much optimism around about. I remember there was a saying, or it might have been a poster, which said something like, "Imagine if they called a war and nobody turned up." And I remember that because there was this whole feeling that we, the people, can stop this. You know, we are powerful enough to be able to stop this and create a new world which is better. And that kind of optimism was, you know, we saw that within the liberation struggles as well. So ZANU would have been, I'm not sure whether it was Zambia, African National Union, or Zimbabwe, African National Union. But anyway, it says, "No one cracked through our wall of forests or through our fortress of wills, joined as one." The nation, that's so you got, you know, women and men joining together to fight the oppressors. And Frelimo was a freedom movement in Mozambique, which of course was colonized by Portugal. I love this poster. Unfortunately, I didn't bring it with me because it's too big. But she looks really happy about the idea of fighting for liberation. The baby looks terrified, very unhappy. But anyway, the antidote to cure colonialism is armed revolution. That is the only way. Next slide, please. So that was the posters I've got of Latin America are a bit different. In Latin America, they were fighting United States imperialism. But you still have the images of women with babies and rifles. I've got loads of posters of women, you know, part of the liberation forces with rifles and babies. A whole notion of being able to create, women could create a new world for themselves and their children. So important. In Latin America, there's a lot of the posters I have, though, are more about music and culture as well, whereas the African ones tend to be more about fighting, really, and the armed struggle. The ones from Latin America I've got, there's a lot of anti-United States posters, but also the notion that culture and revolutionary struggle go together. And I love that Yola Camba poster. Oh, we had a group of Chilean refugees in Newcastle during the 1970s. Allende was assassinated in the early 70s, and Pinochet took over, and there was a lot of people had to leave. And we had some Chilean refugees up here, and they used to bring in music, and Yola Camba was, I think they might have been from El Salvador. Yeah, they are. But if you look at the poster when it comes around, you'll see that, yes, there's lots of music, but also there's the guerrilla fighters hiding in the bushes as well. That actually, you know, music and revolution go together. Next slide, please. So there was I would think, from my perspective, there was a very romantic dimension to the notion of liberation, that actually, you know, this whole thing that you could liberate your country and liberate yourself at the same time as a woman was just a very, very attractive notion, very idealistic, of course. But of course, women weren't just taking up the gun and fighting anti-colonialism. They also had to do everything else as well, because nothing much was changing. You know, patriarchy still ruled okay. This poster here is actually, I think, probably from Portugal. But I think it's a lovely poster because it just shows you what women have to do, everything, to keep the household going, the family going, doing the cooking, the cleaning, looking after children, and they've got scythes, so they're doing the agricultural work, and they're a mechanic as well. And it says around, you know, all that stuff around the edge about needing liberation from domestic work. So I left Montreal in I came up here in January 1973. So I was a young woman, my mid-20s, well, late 20s actually. I'd been involved in various activities in Montreal, lots of anti-war stuff, because Montreal was a big site for anti-war people, the Americans, draft dodgers, and used to go on regular demonstrations outside the United States Embassy, all that kind of stuff. There was a Black Writers' Conference there while I was there, and of course there was, at that time, there was the activity, there was the Quebec separatists as well, who were very active in Montreal at the time. And so I came back to England, got a job up here, and as soon as I got here, I started looking for some like-minded women, who I found. And so that was good. And we started up a women's group, called the Coastal Women's Group. And so it was a group of women who were feminists, like me. I had been very involved in, not very involved in, but I'd been one of my lecturers at Mcgill was a Maoist, and she had a whole coterie of a group of us that learned a great deal about Maoism. So I was a kind of Maoist, but I was also a feminist, and those two things certainly didn't go together. But I was looking for answers to questions, like the big question, why are women oppressed? And it's an important question. I just wonder whether women still ask that question. But I was with a group of women, and some of them were in left groups, some of them were just were working around, were working in the community or working around community issues. And we had a lot of discussions about what caused, why were women oppressed? And one of the things for the women who worked or involved in left groups was that, of course, they were always being told that women had to wait, that actually class war was the important one, and that once the working class had won and changed society, then we could start thinking about doing something about women. And it's all very frustrating. And we knew that we weren't the only women who were concerned with this issue. So there was a women's liberation conference in Newcastle in 1976. And we organised a workshop there to see whether any other women around the country were concerned with that issue and what we could do about it. It was a very well-attended workshop, and we decided to set up a newsletter. And it's called Scarlet Woman, and we called it the newsletter of the socialist current of the women's liberation movement. And it came out from North Shields. We had an editorial group which was made up of some of us and some women from London, the Northwest, Manchester, various other places. And we talked about and asked, what we did, we used to ask for articles from other people around various issues. And the kind of ongoing issue that we were concerned about was actually this question, so why are women oppressed? And we, as a group, I think we came up eventually with this kind of notion that, okay, so patriarchy is a social structure in which men dominate women, and class is a social structure in which those with property dominate those without. And we were arguing that so the society we live in is a patriarchal class society in which the social structures of both hierarchies reinforce each other so that rich, usually white men, dominate all women, especially those from marginalised communities. And that was our stance. And over the period of time, we produced Scarlet Women from 1976 to 1982 was the last one. We kind of refined that idea. But we also talked about different issues. We talked about that issue there was about imperialism. We talked about the last issue was about the nuclear threat. We talked about sexuality. We talked about women's control of their bodies. And we also showcased articles from those women who argued that patriarchy was the most important cause of oppression and those who argued that class was more important. Anyway, so that was Scarlet Woman. Next slide, please. There was a fantastic production of posters. There was a collective called See Red in London that produced lots and lots of posters. And I think this one, Capitalism Depends on Domestic Labour, was one which encapsulates part of that discussion around women and class, really. So that, and you can see the influence there from 1968 Paris as well. That's a really fantastic poster, I think. But basically, that's about women at home servicing the labour force, really. And so they come home from the factory tired, and the women feed them and clothe them and do their ironing and the rest of it and send them back off to work again. One of the things that we would have said about that post is that it doesn't make it clear that women also produce the labour force. They not only service it, but they also produce it. And for us, we would argue that that is actually the key element of patriarchy and women's role within a class and patriarchal society. They produce the labour force, not only look after it. Next one, please. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is, okay, so how far have we come? And we did have lots of conferences in the 1970s. We developed 7 demands. At another time, we could actually look at those demands and see how far we've come. We've still got quite a long way to go with most of them. But I'm focusing here on 2 really important issues because I think that they are the most important aspects of women's role under patriarchal class society. One is the whole issue about controlling our fertility and our bodies. In the 1970s, we had the Abortion Act, 1967. We had that, but during the 70s, there were 3 big, three attempts by Parliament to get rid of it or to change it. And we had huge demonstrations to protect the 1967 Abortion Act. They're said to be some of them, the biggest demonstrations of women since the suffragette times. And we won, in the sense that the Abortion Act was more or less unchanged, which was great. One of the things that motivated that was knowing that if there was no legal abortion, then women tried to get abortions illegally. And one of the women that I remember so well, some of us used to go and see, she lived in Blythe. She actually became a Labour councillor. Lal Brown, her name was, and she was so pleased that there was a new generation of women fighting for abortion rights because she was a founding member of the Abortion Law Reform Association, and she was a member because her mother had, I don't know whether she was an actual midwife, but she had certain kinds of nursing experience, and she used to look after women who'd tried to terminate their pregnancies. And that was where they very often did it. Don't think about it. Can we have the next slide, please? So the whole issue of abortion and ability to control your own body is absolutely key to women's liberation and women's rights. If you think about it, I think in this country we are quite lucky in that most young women don't have to think about that very much anymore. But it's good to remember that actually, in principle, a woman still needs the agreement of 2 doctors to allow her to get a termination. And in Northern Ireland, of course, although Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, the abortion law was not active. They never had it. So women from Northern Ireland, up until very recently, well, actually probably still recently, now, could not get an abortion in Northern Ireland. They had to come over to England to get one, and to add insult to injury, they had to pay for it, because although the National Health Service covers Northern Ireland, when they came over here, they could not get a free abortion on the National Health Service. They had to pay for it. That was continuing sore, as you can imagine, and it's only just recently changed, 2018, I think, or even 19, when actually, for all sorts of reasons, because the the Northern Ireland Assembly was suspended, Parliament took control and insisted that the Abortion Act became legal in Northern Ireland. But still, women in Northern Ireland have difficulty accessing abortion services because there aren't any. Anyway, but they can come over to England. They actually can get their a termination on the National Health Service now, which I suppose is an improvement. But I think we have to remember that we in this country are relatively lucky and fortunate in that way, and we need to remember to keep on fighting for that, because in many parts of the world, it's not true. If you think about the horrors that are going on in the United States, in Poland, which is our neighbour, abortion for any reason is illegal. There's huge fights about that, and women are really fighting hard and campaigning around that, but that's the situation at the moment. And then if you look around the world, it's true that in most countries of the world, women find it very difficult to get terminations. So that poster there is not the church, not the state. It was obviously about the Catholic Church in particular that was against abortion. And that second poster, I think that's a really clever poster, because it's basically saying, women don't have a voice, but that being forced to be pregnant, generates feminism within women. That's how I interpret it anyway. I think it's great. Okay, so what we would say in terms of our analysis of patriarchy is that patriarchy has an interest in making sure that women only have their children. So if you look around the world, you'll see all sorts of ways in which women's sexuality is controlled, so that they don't have access, they are prevented having access or want to have access with men other than their husbands. And, there's lots of ways in different societies where they do that. Arranged marriage, FGM, whatever. So having children, men wanting to have control of their children, control over the women who have their children, is very, very important. And you see it all around the world still. Less so in the West, perhaps, but looking around the world, you'll see it very, very clearly in some societies. And the way in which that is enforced is, and women's role in doing that, which is having children, looking after them, of course, looking after the men as well, is, we would argue, enforced by violence. And, we know that violence still exists in our society. In some ways, we haven't come very far. When I was back in the 70s with a group campaigning to start a refuge in North Tyneside, we would horrify audiences to say, do you know that 2 women a week are killed by their partners or ex-partners? We would say husbands or ex-husbands. And our audience would be horrified. Things haven't changed. Things have not changed. It's still true that 2 women a week or more under lockdown are killed by their partners, ex-partners, a man that they've had some close relationship with. So, and we know, from the death of Sarah Everard, and, in the last 2 years, there's been loads of discussion about this whole issue, which does not seem to have changed very much. Now the focus is on, and the way it has changed, I think, is really good, because I think that it's shifted. It used to be, women used to be blamed all the time. It's because of how they behave. You know, domestic violence is women's fault because they don't do as they're told, they're not good wives, or they're not good this or whatever. Sexual violence happens because, you know, women wear too short skirts or drink too much or whatever. And I'm really heartened by the fact that I think in the last year or so, the dialogue, the discussion about it has begun to change a bit, so that actually the focus is increasingly on men. Men have to change. Men have to support each other to change. It's men's behaviour that's a problem, not women's. And of course, that has gone into the police as well, because men in the police have to change as well, because we know that they haven't been very helpful. So the campaigns around violence against women and girls, you know, continue, and in some ways they become stronger because they have to, because you know, we still, as women, are subjected to a lot of violence, one way or another. Yeah, so that violence happens in the home and and in the streets, and I think we're probably all aware of what that is like and how it impacts on us, and aware of many of the campaigns that are going on around it at the moment. That Reclaim the Night one was a poster for a march in Newcastle. It was, we started the Rape Crisis Centre, I think 1978 was our first kind of inaugural session. And we used to organise Reclaim the Night marches every year. And that was one of the posters. And in terms of the other domestic violence, well, as I say, things haven't changed very much. We still have a long way to go. We still have a long way to go with both of those issues, I think. So I want to end there. Clearly, there's lots of other things that the women's liberation movement was arguing for, like better education, equal opportunity in employment, financial independence, all those kinds of things. And sexuality was really important for lesbians, to have lesbianism recognised and so on and so forth. But that's for another time. So I thought I'd end here with this poster here. This poster, as you can imagine, still from the early 1970s, the idealistic notion. So long as women are not free, the people are not free. And I think that's a good place to end, because it ends on a question, doesn't it? I mean, what do we mean by free?